This is the ExitUS podcast. That's EXIT, Exit US. We're the podcast for the new American dream, moving abroad, to escape the chaos and the dystopia in America after the shocking election. Now, it can seem overwhelming, and it's easy to fall into despair and into depression with everything happening in the world in America right now. But you can take control over the situation by educating yourself on just how you could escape all of this chaos and move to greener pastures abroad. And that's what we're here to do for all of you, to be your guide, to help everyone along, learning about all the legal considerations, the tax implications, the visa requirements, the logistical and emotional and cultural challenges of deciding to move abroad and then actually executing on and achieving that dream. There's so much to consider, and today, in the second episode, we're really lucky to have a fantastic guest to help us along some of the key issues. I just want to say, if you haven't already, please go to our website, exituspodcast.com, that's EXITUS podcast.com, sign up for our mailing list, and be sure to also, of course, subscribe to the podcast. And check out our previous episode. We interviewed a Canadian immigration attorney for our first episode, and we'll be going into a lot of issues in coming episodes too on immigration issues in Europe and a whole range of important discussions. So you'll want to make sure you subscribe and check out what we have in the works. So today, we're very lucky to have the president of a very important nonprofit group, the Association of Americans Resident Abroad, that's been advocating over the decades for expats on a whole range of issues, from voting abroad to tax issues. And right now, their work is more important than ever. And Doris Speer, their president, of course, is an expat herself, originally from Detroit. She's in Paris. And she just has a wealth of ideas and experience and advice for all the things you need to think about as you think about moving abroad. So without any further ado, let's jump into the conversation. It's a good one. Well, thank you so much, Doris, for joining us today. Doris Speer, the president of the Association of Americans Resident Overseas. We're so grateful for everything that you do and have been doing, as well as your predecessors, this great group. And just want to thank you for making time to join us today.
Well, thank you for having me, David. I really appreciate it.
And for those who aren't familiar with your organization, could you give us a quick top-line overview of what you do?
Yeah, AARO, the Association of Americans Resident Overseas, was created more than 50 years ago, initially on the basis to fight on citizenship and voting. At that time, Americans overseas found it almost impossible to vote, and parents overseas could find it almost impossible to transmit citizenship to their children. So AARO was formed to work on those two issues. It was created by women, and after those two issues were substantially dealt with, it then moved on to taxation, banking, Social Security, Medicare, and other issues. We advocate in DC for the rights of Americans abroad. We try to educate the lawmakers about the issues that affect us overseas, and we try to change the laws that hurt us. And we also inform our members on their rights and responsibilities as American citizens.
And you're a nonprofit based in Paris, is that right?
Yeah, we're based in Paris. We're a nonprofit, non-partisan, volunteer organization. We have members in about 40 countries, and we vote in about 40 states.
My goodness, wow. And what would you say are the biggest issues, I'm just curious, right now on your advocacy agenda looking forward?
Well, a month ago, I would have said something a little different. We've always, in the past few years, been focused on taxation. As I'm sure you know, Americans are taxed because of citizenship on our worldwide income in the United States. So we've been fighting to eliminate citizenship-based taxation for a long time. But in the past month or so, I have been working almost nonstop on voting issues. There have been attempts in the United States to disenfranchise the votes of overseas Americans. So that is now at the top of my list. Besides that, we're working on a particular Social Security issue right now, which we're hopeful will pass in this lame duck Congress, which is a law that we're trying to repeal that reduces the Social Security of people who have other pensions. And for us overseas, it would be the foreign pensions.
And you yourself, of course, are an expat. Tell us your story. You were originally with a French multinational in New York, was it? And then you transferred to France.
Yeah, I'll try to give you the short version of the story. I've been an expat twice. I came in my 20s as a musician. I lived here for 2.5 years doing the starving sixth floor walk-up musician. Decided to go back and go to law school and come back with a proper job. So yes, I went back and started law school later in life. And then I went to one of the Wall Street firms because I knew that would be the ticket to getting back to Paris, because the goal when I left was to get back. And from there, I then moved into a French multinational called Alstom. Had been the French equivalent of GE and Siemens. And so the home office was in Paris. And so I thought if I go work for them, I'd have a good chance of coming over here. And it worked out just perfectly. I've been here for 20 years this second time.
And what was the most surprising thing when you made first, went into that expat life, and then as well when you moved back, would you say?
Well, the first time everything was new because I didn't even speak French. I came a bit on a lark, and just going to the grocery store, just ordering at a restaurant, just any basic thing in life was practically impossible for me. So yeah, I had a big learning curve coming from Detroit, not having traveled much, well, not overseas. The second time was a lot easier, of course, because my company moved me over here. But I would say with the second time over, what I discovered was the work ethic is quite different over here. I was one of those type A New York lawyers, Wall Street firm working 100-hour weeks. They don't do that in Paris. And I had to dial back my way of working, as well as dial back my expectations for the people who worked for me. So that was, for me, something quite difficult. And then I began to understand the beauty of the quality of life of living in France. I actually took holidays, although I brought the computer on holiday. But I couldn't convince people who worked for me to take their computer on holiday. But so I would say the work issues for me the second time was something I really had to deal with.
Well, it's fascinating how over the decades too, it's I imagine gotten a lot easier to be an expat. I was fortunate enough to grow up, with a dad in the State Department and USAID, and was overseas in Bulgaria and Ukraine in the 90s and Kenya, and it was a very different thing. I mean, you'd go over, you'd have the weekly edition, foreign edition of the Washington Post, faxed in. You could read in the library of the embassy or what have you. But WhatsApp was not around. iMessage. I mean, Zoom. Let alone so many other tools. These days, we have a whole wave of digital nomads, and the ability. It's some ways a lot less scary to move away because you can stay connected with your friends and family.
Oh, absolutely. And I can, on WhatsApp and with FaceTime, we can dial our friends and family back home for free, whereas it was a big deal to make a phone call back then. You're absolutely right. You had to plan it in advance, and it was a major event that the call from Paris was coming in. Yeah.
And expensive too. So, as people think about, wanting to move overseas, a lot of people are, we're joking about it, perhaps, in our audience, during the results of prior elections, but now there's a new fervor where people really are actually wanting to do it for real. I mean, Eva Longoria, just moved herself in the days after the election. Not everyone has those resources. I'm curious, just a sort of top line overview before we dive into things. So given your position in the organization, you really have a pulse on the American expat community. Do we see the largest concentrations of expats in what might be the stereotypical places we'd think of moving, in Europe and in Canada, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the expats live in Canada and Mexico. After that, it's generally European countries. Canada and Mexico more so because of proximity to the United States. And then Europe because it's a little more understood, a little bit more, people know European countries. They've tended to go there on holiday and such. The places you lived in are probably places where expats aren't trying to run to live to right now. It's not the top of people's lists until they do more research. But you really have to research to decide where's a good place for you. You have to know, why are you leaving? Is it for the right reasons? And are you going to go to the right country for you? There's a lot of thought that has to go into that.
In a recent New York Times piece on moving abroad, you provided some really resonant advice. I thought that before making the jump, it's really important to spend time on the ground, really getting a sense for what it's actually like in the country you're considering. Can you expand on that?
Well, absolutely, because you have to go with your eyes open. You can't just say, oh, people say Spain's great, let's go there. You have to look at the panoply of things. You have to look at financial considerations, tax considerations, social considerations, I call it emotional considerations, and then the practical considerations. Going to the place and test driving it is one of the practical considerations. Another one is, do you know the language? What about health insurance in that place? Would you get some while there, the local system, and would you qualify? That's another practical consideration. But the financial considerations are very important, and the test driving of going to the country for a short time will show you whether or not you really can live in this particular country on the income that you plan to have. First, of course, you have to decide, what am I going to live on? How do I support myself? Am I going to be a digital nomad? Am I going to be paid back in the U.S. and work, on my computer overseas? Am I going to quit my job, try to get a job overseas? Am I going to retire abroad? Am I wealthy enough to just live off my investments? All of that radically changes a few things. One is the tax treatment of what you're doing, and secondly, a big thing people don't talk about enough is currency risk. Because you go overseas, if you are focused on using U.S. dollars back home for all or part of your cost of living, you have to keep in mind that can radically change over time if you go to a place that has a floating exchange rate. For example, when I came to France, it was about 1.2 at that time, meaning $1.20 for €1, while here it went up to almost 1.6. And I had friends here who had to go back home. They didn't have enough dollars to live here. Now the dollar is now 107, 108, something like that. So it's much better for the U.S. dollars, but that radically changes your tax return because you have to convert everything at an exchange rate, and it also affects whether you can actually live. Because inflation has, since COVID, there has been inflation everywhere in the world, not just in the U.S. So for people who say, oh, I want to have a better living overseas because it's cheaper over there, go there and try it for a while. You might find it's a lot more expensive than it was when you went there on holiday 3 years ago.
Absolutely. And, as Americans, we're so fortunate with our powerful passport to be able to go anywhere it feels like we want on holiday. But it's a whole nother thing to navigate the world of visas for residency and even aspiring to perhaps citizenship abroad. If you're not, wealthy enough to look at golden visas and, access to the EU passport someday through investing in a VC fund in Portugal or what have you. What's the reality check that people should be thinking about? And granted, we're having other guests who are immigration attorneys, in specific countries, but looking broadly, is there a gut check Americans should have about just how hard it is to set up shop long term, to work and to live for the long term abroad?
Yeah, I think the first thing you have to keep in mind is you are now the immigrant. When you're in the States, people talk about the immigrants. Well, guess what? You are now that person. And a lot of these other countries, they have this anti-immigrant fervor, just like in the United States, and they're making it more difficult. There are now, in some countries, there are tests of the language where you actually have to have a certain proficiency in the language. And you have to, of course, be there for a requisite amount of time. You have to show a lot of paperwork. And it's often, at times, at the whim of the person interviewing you as to whether or not you actually can get your papers. I have an example. My husband and I are French citizens, but when we applied for citizenship, he was initially rejected for no reason other than we think the woman was unhappy after she looked at our tax returns, saw our address, didn't like his last name. We don't know what, but she actually turned him down. And my husband's father had acquired French nationality, and she told my husband, you're not French enough. And she took all of the paperwork of my husband's French nationality out of the file and said, we don't need this. I think you need your father's paperwork. So we filed an appeal, and we won on the appeal. But we never figured out why she did that, but she somehow just didn't like him. The only reason I got it is because I had a diploma at one of what they call the haute école, and that I found out later is what guaranteed me the nationality. Otherwise, she would have turned me down too. She just didn't like him.
Absolutely. I mean, and that was then, and now, we're seeing cartoons in Canada of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police building a wall between Canada and the U.S. With the potential rush of people looking to move abroad from America, it's probably only going to get tougher as people start to feel okay, we've had enough of these Trump-ugees, as one Canadian attorney called it. So better to start looking now than later. What advice do you give to people who contact you for how to research, these paths to work visas? How to find an immigration attorney? Are there particular books or online resources you point people to, or advice for finding guidance?
Well, AARO has a partnership with one of the companies that assists people in relocation and golden visas and things like that. They specialize in some of the Caribbean countries and the Southern European countries. We have another person that's with us who handles people who are trying to emigrate into France. So if people are members of AARO, they want to talk to us about that, we can point them in those directions. Otherwise, Googling things, researching things, you just start with that, do your research, get the names of people. You really have to put some time into it. But when you think about it, it's maybe the rest of your life. It's a significant decision to leave your country and to go to a different country. You really have to really research it as much as you can, and contact these international organizations. Contact AARO. We're all expats. We've all done this. We can help you, with some specifics.
And you don't have to be overseas yet to join AARO. Is that right?
Correct.
And how much is it?
We're at the moment for a single person, €65 a year. For a family couple, $85 a year.
So people may want to just go check it out. It's AARO.org to learn more. What other benefits are there of joining AARO?
We offer a health insurance policy for expatriates. We created this with an insurer about maybe 25 years ago, and it's tailor-made for people who move overseas but yet have connections back in the U.S. It covers people in up to 2 resident countries for somebody who's has the apartment in Paris and the summer home in Geneva or something like that, and up to 30 days in the United States. So when you go back and visit family, you've got coverage there for emergencies and things like that. Because as you know, if you live overseas, for people over 65, they do not have the benefit of Medicare. And so they need to have insurance when they go back to the States. And for people who live overseas, certainly you are often a member of the health insurance of the country. They have, what U.S. calls Medicare for all, exists in a lot of other countries of the world, but one usually has a top-up insurance on top of that. We provide that too. So that's another aspect we have. We also have a biweekly newsletter where we inform our members of what's going on, what's being voted on, what to advocate for, and travel tips and things like that. Dogs now are, it's hard to bring your dog, things like that. The lighter stuff, but also we inform our members of the progress we're trying to make on, I call it the substantive stuff, the deeper stuff, the tax issues. Banking is a real problem also. Hadn't mentioned that yet, but a lot of expats keep in mind when you move overseas, not only is it possible that you get kicked out of your local bank because they don't like Americans because of filings they must make to the U.S., but the U.S. banks are now starting to kick out Americans with overseas addresses. And I've been kicked out of 2 banks already. A lot of members are contacting us to say, what do we do? I just got kicked out. What they have done is actually, was it Wells Fargo sent a letter to my girlfriend and said, move your money within 30 days or we will send you a check.
My God. Wow.
She had to find somewhere to move it, but with an overseas address, other places didn't want her. So
Sure.
That's a real big issue, and we're really fighting hard on that issue to find a way to require U.S. banks to not use just an overseas address as the reason for kicking people out.
Crazy. Tell us more about some of these unexpected logistical challenges that people should be prepared for. Banking as one.
Well, yeah, banking. If you can, try to keep a U.S. address in the United States. Try to keep a U.S. bank account. Don't close everything down. You never know when you're going to need it. For example, during the COVID, the people overseas were receiving COVID checks, but they had nowhere to deposit them.
Sure.
So keep a bank account. Try to keep an address there. And also just when you move to a place, keep in mind that you will likely be going back now and then. It depends, of course, on your connections back home, but most people have parents, children, and or grandchildren, right? So at some stage in life, you have to deal either with the birth of a new grandchild or the aging parent. These last 20 years, I've gone back to the U.S. 2 to 3 times a year. So when you decide where you want to live overseas, keep in mind that if you go to a complicated place to get to, that just complicates when you get that phone call, as I did on a Saturday night at midnight, your father's passed.
Oh my gosh.
I had to be there the next day. If I were living in Kenya like you had, that would have been complicated.
Right.
So keep that in mind. Also, moving away from that topic, but back to banking, for example, if you have IRAs or 401ks, we see people with 401ks are not finding them closed down as we see with IRAs, because IRA is a personal account. So of course, you're going to do what you need to do for your own financial reasons, but all else being equal, leave the 401k in place. Don't roll it into an IRA because that's more likely to be able to stay as it is. But of course, if you need to roll it over for other reasons, do what you need. But that I've just noticed that in the past couple of years, that seems to be something that's popping up. Also, people have to remember that once you're overseas, if you have bank accounts over here, which you will, you have to report them back to the United States. And everybody should write this down. FBAR, FBAR. If you don't do it, the penalties are huge. And we are following that very closely, and we see penalties in the millions. The penalties it's up to 50% of what's in the account that was not reported.
Incredible.
So be careful about those filings. And that's on top of course, the tax returns that you must file when you're overseas.
So if people are listening, as we record this, it's about a week and a half out from the election. Let's say someone, was expecting a different result in the election and just, right now has just decided, for the first time, they haven't been an expat before. Maybe they've had limited experience living abroad. They're just sitting here saying they know they want to move somewhere else. They're so tired of all the chaos from the last Trump administration, and they just can't handle it. The nominations now, all they know is they want to move abroad. They just don't know where to start. What are some of the basics to have in mind? This is a tough thing to do. Realistically, if you're starting from scratch without connections abroad, without an obvious path to doing this, people can't expect to move, next month, to move before January 20th. It's a long, hard path to make this happen. What would you tell people about just how long they should have in mind? It's likely to take them to figure things out on all the logistical matters, let alone, getting a job offer or figuring out the financial side of how you can make it happen.
Well, the first thing is the financial side. Are you planning to keep your job and work remotely, or are you planning to change jobs? How do you support yourself? That's the first thing, and that is what drives the timing. If you are able with your employer to live overseas and work from overseas, that of course shortens up the timing, but you are not going to be settled anywhere before Inauguration Day. You are not. I think that should be considered a project for 2025 that one should look into. And again, first of all, you have to find the country. I mean, you really need to think about that. Make a short list. Make a pros and cons. Make a financial plan. How much money? Again, if you're keeping your same job, you then have an idea as to how much you will be earning. But if you plan to try to get a new job, I really think it's not a good idea to just show up and try to find a job when you're already overseas. That usually doesn't work very well. It worked for me the first time I came, but I was lucky, and that was way back then. But nowadays, if you want to move overseas and you need to have a job overseas to do so, you need to start looking at international companies which are based in the U.S. As to what I did, I was looking for French companies which had operations in the U.S. where I could get my foot in the door on the U.S. side and then get transferred over. That's one way to do it. Or if you have a particular skill that you think is useful for foreign companies, do the usual job search thing. Get online, go on LinkedIn or whatever you do, and try to get a job overseas and have them bring you over. Or if a lot of times, unless you're really highly skilled at something, they will expect you to bring yourself over. It just depends on the income level and the education level you have and the kind of job you would be having. But this is not something that happens in 3 weeks. You just have to be patient. It takes time.
And I imagine these multinationals may get an increase in applications in the U.S. as other people pursue this path to an escape. I suppose one piece of advice might be for people looking to network their way in, look for, foreign chambers of commerce or business roundtables or business groups in your city, in your country, here in the U.S. There's an association for every country. The UK Americans making up a group, Business Council, or the French Chamber in the U.S. Just not actual groups, but every country will have one or more associations, groups in the U.S. Looking to bring together companies and folks to bring closer ties together between these two countries. So getting involved, going to events, holiday parties with these groups might be one way to start to meet some people. Any other advice for networking your way?
Well, it's just what you said. It's networking, but on an international scale.
Yeah.
And using the chambers of commerce is one good thing. Talking to people who are overseas and trying to get to know people who are already overseas. There are also universities that operate overseas. You can try that. Maybe even think about coming overseas the first time as a student, if you have the money to do so. And then while there, if you have papers for being a student, then hit the pavement and get a sense for how you can maybe flip that into something more lucrative. That's another idea. But for somebody who is going to just want to get a job overseas and move overseas, that's about as difficult as it is.
I guess an easy way to start is, if you're planning your 2025 vacations, look for a trip in a country you think you might want to move to, and use that vacation as a research trip.
And if you don't speak a foreign language, then you might want to restrict the countries to countries which are Anglophone. Certainly, they speak English in a lot of countries in the world. Most European countries speak also English, but it is quite difficult if you don't speak the local language to actually get a job and work in that country, or even just live in the country. You get something in the mail if you can't read what it is. When I first moved here, my first trip, I couldn't read my letters in the mail. I, thank God, had a French boyfriend and said, "What are they saying?" until I could figure it out for myself. So you really have to think about that. Maybe if you've picked a country, you're doing your research and you say, okay, it's going to be a Spanish country because I have some notions of Spanish, start taking lessons. Go to the local language place and just try to beef up your language. That will only help. And while there, that might give you more ideas.
Any other top line advice for people who just know they want to move abroad but don't know how to do it? Other steps to be taking now?
To talk to other people and to do as much research as possible, and then just maybe to think back and say to oneself, do I really need to do this? If it's so difficult, if one can't get a job, one doesn't have a job, one doesn't speak foreign languages, maybe this too will pass. I hate to say that, but one can't always have what one wants, and I certainly think it's wonderful to live overseas. I would never change my life for anything in the world. But it's difficult nowadays. It's much more difficult than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And you just have to pound the internet pavement and do your own research.
Talk about how it's gotten more difficult.
It's more difficult in that a lot of countries, as I said earlier, don't want as many immigrants in the country, especially the golden visa types.
There
are some countries where the property values have gone very high because of people coming in who are wealthier, and they raise it up. So there's a little bit of an anti-wealth sentiment in some places. So
Sure.
it's more difficult in that way, and also for purposes of getting paperwork, the right to live in a place. The rules have just gotten more and more difficult. When I first came the first time, I won't go into any detail, but let's just say it was by the seat of my pants
Sure.
that I was able to get my proper paperwork. That would never have flown today. They're much more precise about it. I think also with computers and with communication as it is, it's easier to follow up on things and to check on things, and so you can't do things, I say, the old way, as we used to.
Well,
I'm sorry, I'm not more precise about that, but it's just a sense and a feeling that I have, and also what I've seen. Some examples of people who were denied their carte de séjour in France for reasons that weren't terribly clear.
Fascinating. Well, it definitely is a eye-opening thing to think about, all the practical matters here of moving abroad. Just to end on a positive note, what are some of your favorite things about moving abroad that make your old friends back home jealous?
I walk out my front door and I have the beauty of Paris at my fingertips. Within 10 minutes of walking, I can have any service that I need. The shoemaker is across the street, the bodega is next door, the boulangerie is over here. Down the street, 1 block that way, I have the butcher, the fish person, a flower shop, and all that other stuff. Oh, there are pharmacies everywhere. Healthcare is cheap. Drugs are practically given away. It's very cheap here. And the public transportation is fabulous. I don't have a car. I gave up my car several years ago. I don't miss it. And I have a card to go on the metro. It's very inexpensive. I can go anywhere I want. And I walk 5-10 minutes that way to the Louvre, 15 minutes that way to Saint Michel, 20 minutes that way to the Eiffel Tower, and behind me, not 10 minutes, is Musée Rodin, and the Musée d'Orsay is down the street.
Oh, my favorite museum in the world.
Yeah, so I loved life. In the States, there's a new movement I heard about a year ago, what they call it, the 15-minute city. Have you heard about it?
Yes.
Well, that's Europe. That's Europe. In every metropolitan area in Europe that I have seen is just like that. And you are on foot and you are walking, and you don't need to jump in the car and drive places. You just go downstairs and do your errand, come back, and it's I'd say a more old-fashioned life. It is an old-fashioned life, and I greatly appreciate it. And I know we have a lot of tourists here, a lot of friends who come to stay with us. Everybody loves it, and they all are really quite jealous.
Well, I'm sure.
I totally encourage it to anybody. And if you're not sure what country to go to, what city to go to, I adore Paris.
Well, indeed, I think everyone listening, feels that jealousy, and moreover feels gratitude to you for sharing your advice with all of us. You're most kind, and I really do encourage our listeners to consider joining AARO and not only getting the benefits you provide, but also supporting an organization that's fighting for making lives easier for American expats, current and future, easier. So thank you so much, and Godspeed for the good work you do, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. And one final note is, please persevere. If you really, really want it, you will get it. I'm proof of that. It took me 16 years in New York before I got back here, and I got here. And so if you really want it, you will make it happen. So everybody listening, don't be dissuaded by some of these difficulties we've talked about. It is worth it if it's really what you want to do.
Well, merci beaucoup. That's great advice. Persistence. Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Doris.